The tension at my 68th birthday dinner wasn't something my guests could see. It was something I felt in my chest, like a low hum beneath the laughter and the clinking of glasses. The kind of feeling you develop after 31 years of running a construction company, reading contracts line by line, watching people's hands when their mouths were saying something else entirely. My son-in-law had been watching me all evening. Not the way family watches you at a birthday, not warm, not distracted, not the casual glance of someone half listening to a story they've already heard. He was watching the way a man watches something he wants, like a surveyor walking a piece of land, measuring what he doesn't yet own. His name is Preston. He married my daughter Ellie 6 years ago in a small ceremony out in Asheville, North Carolina. I paid for the wedding. I paid for the rehearsal dinner. I paid for the honeymoon to Costa Rica because he said he'd already committed his savings to a business venture that somehow never materialized into anything I could ever find on paper. Ellie is 34. She has her mother's eyes and her mother's patience, which is to say, nearly infinite. Her mother passed 8 years ago. Ovarian cancer. I still keep her photo on the mantel in the living room, and I still talk to her sometimes when the house gets quiet enough. That evening, the house was not quiet. My brother had driven up from Savannah with his wife, and 3 of my oldest friends from the trade were there with their spouses. My granddaughter, Cooper, Ellie and Preston's little girl just turned 5, was chasing the family dog around the back porch until my sister-in-law finally scooped her up and got her settled with some crackers and a juice box. It was a good evening, or it should have been. I'd sold my company 4 months earlier, Buchanan & Sons Construction, except there were never any sons, so it became mine alone when my father passed, and I'd built it from a regional outfit doing residential additions into a firm that landed commercial contracts across 3 states. The sale went through in March. I won't say the exact number, but it was enough to change the rest of my life. And more importantly, it was enough that people who hadn't paid much attention to me in recent years were suddenly paying a great deal of it. Preston had known about the sale since January. He'd been in the room, actually, when I told Ellie. I'd watched his expression shift from polite interest to something more focused. He started calling more after that, dropping by on weekends. He developed a sudden interest in my lawn, my gutters, my home maintenance schedule. He brought a bottle of bourbon one Sunday and sat on the back porch with me for 2 hours, talking about opportunities in the current market. I listened. I always listen. But I learned a long time ago that there's a difference between what a man says and what he wants. What Preston wanted was access. That birthday evening, I had 31 people in my house. My longtime accountant was there, a woman named Judith who has handled my finances since before Ellie was born and who has, over the decades, become one of the most trusted people in my life. I'd asked her to come early that day, before the guests arrived, because I needed to walk her through some documents I'd had prepared. A new will? I'd already spoken to my attorney the month before. I'd been making changes, quiet changes, the kind you make when you've watched a situation long enough to understand where it's heading. The house would go to Ellie outright, no joint ownership. A portion of the sale proceeds was going into a trust for Cooper that neither parent could access until she turned 25. A separate charitable remainder trust was being established in my late wife's name for a scholarship fund at the community college where she used to teach adult literacy classes. Judith had the paperwork in her bag. Preston didn't know any of that. What he did know, or thought he knew, was that I was a 68-year-old man with more money than he'd ever see, a house full of guests, and a glass of bourbon I'd barely touched. I noticed him near the side table about 40 minutes into the evening. There's a particular kind of stillness a person has when they're trying not to look like they're doing something, a performance of casualness. He was refilling his glass, or pretending to, and he was positioned with his back mostly turned, but his shoulders were doing something they shouldn't have been. Tight, focused, deliberate. I was on the other side of the room talking to my old friend Bernard, who was telling me about his youngest grandchild's Little League season. I was nodding at the right moments, but my eyes hadn't left Preston's back for about 45 seconds. He reached toward the side table where my glass sat, I'd set it down 20 minutes earlier when Cooper climbed into my lap, and I'd forgotten to bring it with me when I moved across the room. He was brief, smooth, the kind of move you only notice if you're already watching. I kept talking to Bernard. I kept my voice even. I said something about how Little League was the best thing for kids that age. Bill's character, Bernard, agreed. I smiled. Inside, something went very cold and very still. I am not a reckless man. I have never been a reckless man. I spent 3 decades managing job sites where the difference between careful and careless was the difference between a man going home to his family and a man not going home at all. You learn in that environment to think before you move, to confirm before you act, to never ever respond to what you think you saw, only to what you know. So I didn't react. I moved naturally across the room about 10 minutes later, falling into conversation near the side table, and I casually picked up my glass. I brought it toward my lips once, as if I was going to drink, and then set it back down while leaning over to look at something my brother's wife was showing me on her phone. And while I was leaning, I switched glasses with the empty one beside the bourbon bottle. Then I excused myself to the back porch. I stood out there alone for about 3 minutes. The night air in October in the mountains has a specific weight to it, cool and clean and honest in a way that indoor air never quite manages. I thought about Ellie. I thought about Cooper chasing the dog. I thought about whether I was wrong. I was not wrong. When I came back in, I found Judith in the kitchen and told her quietly what I'd observed. She didn't say anything dramatic. She's not a dramatic woman. She took out her phone and said she was going to make a call, and I knew she was calling my attorney, who I'd already spoken to about the possibility, not probability, I had told myself, possibility that something like this might happen. The evening continued. I watched. Preston drank. He laughed at things other people said. He put his arm around Ellie's shoulders and kissed the top of her head in that particular way he has, the way that looks affectionate from 12 feet away and feels, up close, more like a man marking territory. About 50 minutes after I'd made the switch, he came to find me. He said he wasn't feeling well. He said it quietly, the way men say things they don't want to explain. His face had gone slightly gray. His eyes were glassy. He said he thought he might have eaten something that didn't agree with him, and asked if he could lie down in the guest room. I told him, of course. I told him I'd check on him shortly. I went back to my guests. I sat with Cooper while she showed me a drawing she'd done of what she said was a horse, but looked considerably more like a cloud with legs. I told her it was the best horse I'd ever seen. She was very pleased. 20 minutes later, my brother came to find me. He said Preston seemed very unwell. His voice had that particular register that means more than the words are saying. I called 911. Not because I wanted to protect Preston. I want to be honest about that. I called because there was a 5-year-old child in the next room, and because whatever was happening needed to be handled properly, by people with credentials and documentation and a clear chain of accountability. The paramedics came. They took Preston out on a stretcher while Ellie held Cooper against her shoulder and kept saying, "Daddy's going to be fine, baby. Daddy just isn't feeling well." I stood near the door and watched the ambulance back out of the driveway. My attorney arrived shortly after, along with a friend of his from the county sheriff's office who I'd called from the back porch that evening. The glass I'd set aside, the one from the side table, the one I hadn't drunk from, had been in a Ziploc bag inside the kitchen cabinet since the moment I'd come back in from the porch. Judith had handled that, quietly, while I was talking to my brother. The dog spaniel came back 2 days later. Rohypnol, a significant dose, enough to incapacitate a man my age and size for several hours, or, depending on cardiac history and alcohol consumption, potentially longer. Preston had been alone in my home office the previous Sunday. He'd come over to help me with what he called some measurements for the back deck project, another project, like the business ventures, that existed primarily as a reason to be present in my house. He'd asked to use the bathroom, and I directed him to the one down the hall off my office. I didn't know it at the time, but Judith had noticed something odd when she came to pick up some documents the Monday after. A drawer in my desk had been opened and not fully closed. She'd mentioned it offhand, and I'd filed it in the part of my mind where I keep things I'm not yet ready to act on. My attorney walked me through what the investigators found. Preston had done some research. He'd identified the medications I keep in the top drawer of my desk. Blood pressure, cholesterol, nothing unusual for a man my age. And he'd apparently done enough homework to know that combining rohypnol with those specific medications and a few drinks could produce effects that might look, in a man of 68 with no prior suspicious incidents, like a medical event rather than something deliberate. He hadn't planned on getting caught. He planned on an incapacitated father-in-law, access to a house full of documents, and enough time to do whatever he had come to do. What he had come to do, the investigators eventually determined, was get into the small fireproof safe in my office closet. The safe where I keep original executed documents, the deed to the house, the original partnership agreements from the company sale, and, until Judith had taken it home with her that afternoon before the party, the original copy of my newly revised will. He didn't know Judith had taken it. He didn't know I'd already had the deed transferred into a trust 3 weeks prior, my attorney's suggestion, and one I'd taken without fully understanding at the time why he'd recommended it with such quiet urgency. He didn't know any of that. He knew that I was an old man with money and a desk drawer full of documents, and he'd done the math in the way that certain people do, the people who look at family and see arithmetic. Ellie came to see me the morning after the hospital. She sat at my kitchen table with her coffee in both hands, and she didn't say anything for a long time. Cooper was with my brother's wife for the day. The house was quiet. I did not tell Ellie what I suspected before I had confirmation. I want to be clear about that. I would not have done that to her, planted a suspicion that might have been wrong, made her choose a side before the facts were established. She is my daughter. She deserved facts, not feelings, even when the feelings were very strong. When I told her what the investigation had found, she sat very still. She didn't cry right away. She looked at the table. She turned her coffee cup in a slow circle with both hands, the way she used to do as a little girl when she was working through something complicated, and I just sat across from her and waited, because some things cannot be hurried. Then she cried. I went around the table and put my hand on her back, and she cried for a long time, and I didn't say anything about moving on, or silver linings, or anything like that. Sometimes the only true thing you can do for someone you love is stay present in the hardest moment without trying to make it smaller than it is. When she was done, she asked me 2 questions. The first was whether Cooper was safe. I told her yes. Absolutely yes. Cooper was never in any danger and would continue not to be. The second was whether I was angry at her. I told her the truth, which is that I have never once in my daughter's life been angry at her for something someone else did to her, that she could not have known, that the man she married had hidden this from her as carefully as he had hidden it from everyone, and that the failure was his, entirely and permanently his, and not a single fiber of it belonged to her. She nodded. She turned her coffee cup one more time. Then she asked if I wanted more coffee, and I said yes, and she got up and refilled my cup, and we sat together for another hour talking about Cooper's upcoming kindergarten registration and whether my brother's wife's cornbread recipe was better than my late wife's, which is a debate that has been ongoing in this family for the better part of 20 years and shows no sign of resolution. Preston was charged with criminal administration of a controlled substance, first-degree attempted burglary, and 2 additional charges related to the investigation into his access to my office the prior week. His attorney tried, briefly, to suggest that I'd been mistaken about what I'd seen, that the substance in the glass had some other explanation. The tox report made that argument very short-lived. He pled guilty 8 months later. The sentence was 5 years, with eligibility for parole after 3. Ellie filed for divorce before the plea was entered. The family law attorney I retained for her is among the best in the state, and the outcome of those proceedings was, given the circumstances, appropriately one-sided. The scholarship fund in my wife's name held its first awards ceremony the following spring. 12 recipients. The youngest was 19 years old, a young woman who'd grown up in foster care in Buncombe County and wanted to study nursing. She stood at the podium in a too-big blazer and said that she'd applied for the scholarship because she'd heard it was named after a woman who had believed that it was never too late to learn something new. That's not something I put in the fund description. That was just who my wife was, apparently, still speaking for herself 20 years after she'd left the adult literacy classroom for the last time. I sat in the third row and did not embarrass myself mostly. Cooper started kindergarten that fall. She is, according to her teacher, enthusiastic and very verbal, which I could have told them myself. She calls me every Sunday on the tablet Ellie set up for her, and she shows me things, drawings, rocks she's found, a caterpillar she named Gerald who lived in a jar on her windowsill for 4 days before being released back to the garden with considerable ceremony. I am 69 years old now. I wake up early before the sun most mornings, and I sit on the back porch with my coffee, and I think about what it means to have spent a lifetime building something. Not the company. The company was a vehicle. I mean the other things. The trust that takes 30 years to earn and 5 minutes to lose. The way a child's voice sounds when she calls just to show you a caterpillar. The particular stillness of a mountain morning when everything you protected is still intact. I learned early in my career that the most important thing you can do on a job site isn't swing the hammer. It's know where everything is. Know the load-bearing walls. Know what holds the structure up and what happens if you compromise it, and what you owe to the people who are counting on the structure to hold. I spent 31 years knowing those things about buildings. I spent 68 years learning to know them about people. Some lessons cost more than others. Some you learn early and carry forward, and some arrive late at a birthday party in the form of a man who looked at a family and saw only what he could take from it, and found out too late that the old man in the corner had been reading job sites a great deal longer than he'd been reading people. I've been thinking about Preston a lot lately, not with anger, but with something closer to sadness, the kind that settles in when you watch someone throw away everything that could have been good about their life for something they were never going to keep anyway. He had a daughter who called him Daddy. He had a wife who loved him in good faith for 6 years. He had a father-in-law who, if he had simply been honest, would have helped him. I'm not a perfect man. I've made bad hires and bad deals and decisions I regret. But I have never looked at someone who trusted me and asked myself what I could take from them. That's not a brag. It's just a line I understood early, that the moment you cross it, something in you changes permanently, and you can't go back to who you were before. What Preston miscalculated wasn't the dose or the timing or the layout of my office. What he miscalculated was the cost of treating intelligence like an obstacle instead of a quality to respect. He saw a 68-year-old man at a birthday party with a glass of bourbon, and he decided that was the full picture. He didn't ask what 31 years of reading people on job sites had taught me. He didn't consider that the people who've been watching the world quietly for decades are often the hardest ones to fool. That kind of patience, the kind that observes before it acts, that confirms before it responds, isn't something that comes from a book. It comes from a lifetime of understanding that the truth will always surface if you give it enough room. I think about what Ellie said to me at my kitchen table the morning after. She asked if I was angry at her. That question broke something open in me, because it told me exactly what the previous 6 years had done to her sense of herself, that she had somehow absorbed responsibility for a man's choices, the way people do when they've been made to feel like the problem. Raising a child right doesn't mean protecting them from every hard thing. It means building something in them that holds when the hard things come. Ellie sat at that table devastated and still asked first about her daughter, still made the coffee, still found a way to keep moving. That's not accident. That's character built over years, tested in the worst possible moment and found solid. And Cooper, 5 years old, showing me a drawing of a horse that looked like a cloud with legs, completely unbothered by the weight of what was happening around her, because the adults in her life made sure she didn't have to carry it. That's the only thing I've ever really wanted to get right. Not the company, not the contracts, not the sale. The child who inherits what we leave behind. The scholarship fund carries my wife's name now. 12 students in the first class. A 19-year-old from foster care who wanted to be a nurse. She said she applied because she'd heard the fund was named after a woman who believed it was never too late to learn something new. That's the whole thing right there. You build your character quietly, year after year, in the choices nobody's watching. And then one day, long after you're gone, it speaks for itself. Preston chose differently. That's on him, entirely and permanently on him. I just made sure the record was clear.